Hi guys, tonight we will step back into the 1940s, into a world where daily life could change overnight. Cities plunged into darkness, families learned to live without power, and the simplest tasks became survival skills. This is not just about war, but about how ordinary people endured when the lights went out and the silence of night became absolute. Before we get started, if you enjoy exploring hidden corners of history at a slower pace, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from. I'd love to connect with you there. During the Second World War, blackouts were one of the most immediate ways civilians felt the war pressing into their homes. Across Europe and parts of Asia, the sudden absence of electric light was not only a safety measure, but also a direct intrusion into family routines. Entire streets that once glowed with the warmth of lamps and radios fell into complete darkness. For many, the first nights were disorienting. Parents tried to calm children who were frightened by the unfamiliar quiet, while older generations remembered times before electricity and took the lead in teaching how to cope. One of the first strategies was adaptation of sight and rhythm. People learned to let their eyes adjust to moonlight and the faint glow of stars. Curtains were made thicker, sometimes layered with dark fabric, so no light escaped from candles inside. Families discovered that the human body could adjust to cycles of natural light. Many went to bed earlier, rising with dawn to use precious daylight for chores. A grandmother in rural England might remind her grandchildren how her own mother once sewed clothes by sunlight, so they too picked up the habit of finishing tasks before dusk. The blackout was not only about darkness, but about silence. Radios were often restricted or ran on small batteries that had to be carefully saved. Instead of voices coming through the airwaves, people began reading aloud from books or telling stories by candlelight. The spoken word became entertainment again, reviving traditions of folk tales and personal memories that might otherwise have been lost. Candles themselves were a matter of caution and creativity. Paraffin shortages meant that not every household could rely on steady supplies. People improvised with homemade lamps, small glass jars filled with cooking fat and a piece of cloth acting as a wick. Though smoky and dim, they offered enough light for writing letters, mending socks or checking ration books. Such lamps became symbols of resilience, crafted not from abundance but from whatever scraps were left behind after meals. Cooking without electricity was another adjustment. In cities, where electric stoves had become common, families returned to coal, wood, or makeshift outdoor fires. Pots blackened with soot became standard kitchen tools. The smell of smoke clung to clothes and homes, yet it also meant a warm meal could still be served. Children learned to gather sticks, neighbours shared coal deliveries, and ingenuity replaced convenience. Beyond the home, the lack of streetlights created a new kind of community awareness. People walked cautiously, carrying small shaded lanterns or nothing at all, relying on memory of familiar routes. Neighbours would call out to one another, guiding the elderly across uneven pavements. The night belonged equally to fear and solidarity. In those quiet hours, people discovered how much they depended on each other. Blackouts also reshaped social gatherings. Evening dances were moved earlier, ending before curfew. Religious services often took place in the afternoon, while night was left to whispers and rest. The loss of electricity forced a slower pace, reminding families of rhythms that had existed before modern power. For many, it was a return to an older way of life, though shadowed now by war and uncertainty. The first stage of survival without electricity was therefore not only about tools or tricks, but about a shift of mindset. It meant learning to find comfort in natural cycles, rediscovering traditions, and crafting small solutions with limited means. In the darkness of those wartime nights, civilians found both challenge and quiet resilience, teaching themselves that even without electric light, life could still continue. When electricity was lost, one of the greatest challenges was keeping homes warm during cold seasons. In countries like Poland, Germany, or the Soviet Union, winters were harsh, and without reliable electric heaters, families had to depend on older, more labour-intensive methods. Wood-burning stoves became the heart of survival, glowing not only with heat, but also with the sense of security they gave. People scavenged for any burnable material, fallen branches, broken furniture, even scraps of construction wood to feed their stoves. Children often joined the task, walking out in pairs with baskets to collect twigs and pine cones. The fireplace or stove was not just a heater, but a centerpiece of family life. Around it, meals were cooked, stories told, and small chores completed under the modest light of the flames. Ashes from the fire were carefully reused, sometimes spread on icy paths outside to prevent slipping, or mixed with soap substitutes for cleaning. Nothing was wasted, because waste could mean discomfort or danger. In areas where wood was scarce, coal was another option, though difficult to obtain. Long lines at coal depots became a part of urban life, and many families could only afford small amounts. Because coal burned longer, it was used sparingly, save for nights when frost crept through walls. In rural areas, some households turned to peat, cutting and drying it to stack for fuel. The smell of burning peat became a familiar background to wartime life, smoky but dependable. Without electricity, people also had to rethink insulation. Thick curtains were hung not only to keep out light during blackouts, but also to trap precious heat inside. Windows were sometimes covered with cardboard or fabric, and families slept closer together to share body warmth. Layering clothing indoors became routine. Wool socks, scarves, and old coats were worn even to bed. It was not uncommon for 2 or 3 children to sleep in the same bed, comforted by each other's presence as much as by the shared heat. In cities under bombing threats, basements and shelters posed special problems. Underground spaces were cold, damp, and lacked any form of heating. Families brought heavy blankets, pillows, and hot water bottles filled from boiled kettles. A bottle wrapped in cloth could stay warm for hours, serving as a small comfort during long nights of sirens and fear. The absence of electricity also meant the absence of reliable lighting when tending to stoves or lamps. Many accidents occurred: burns, smoke inhalation, or small fires caused by unstable makeshift candles. Communities often organised small groups to check on neighbours, ensuring elderly people managed their fires safely. In this way, survival was a blend of individual resourcefulness and collective care. Yet alongside these hardships, the hearth gave emotional warmth too. The glow of firelight provided a sense of continuity, reminding people of older generations who had lived without electricity long before. Grandparents would often remark that the war had forced everyone back to the old ways, and while younger people missed the convenience of switches and radiators, there was comfort in knowing they were not the first to endure. Thus, surviving the cold without electricity was not simply about fire. It was about resilience, adaptation, and the rediscovery of timeless practices that bound communities together against the chill of uncertainty. Food preservation without electricity quickly became one of the most pressing concerns for civilians. Before the war, many families had relied on refrigerators to keep milk, butter, or meat fresh. But when power vanished, they had to turn back to traditional methods that were both time-consuming and essential. One of the oldest techniques was salting. Salt was not only a seasoning but a safeguard against hunger, as it slowed the spoiling of fish, pork, and even vegetables. In coastal regions, people would preserve herring or mackerel in heavy brine, while inland families rubbed salt deeply into cuts of meat and stored them in cool cellars. This gave households a small reserve to last through difficult weeks. Smoking was another widespread practice. Simple smokehouses were built from wooden barrels, sheds, or even holes in the ground lined with stones. Meat and fish hung inside, absorbing the flavour of smouldering wood while also gaining weeks of added shelf life. For children, the smell of smoke became tied to the memory of war, a reminder that survival depended on age-old wisdom. Canning and pickling offered yet another lifeline. Glass jars sealed with wax or metal lids lined the shelves of countless pantries. Families spent autumn afternoons preserving cucumbers, beets, apples, or cabbage, knowing these would be their vitamins through the winter. Vinegar and fermentation were as valuable as gold, because they kept food edible when fresh produce was scarce. Even city dwellers, if lucky enough to have a small garden, tried to pickle whatever they could harvest. Without electricity, people also turned to natural refrigeration. Cold cellars, caves, or even buried storage boxes became substitutes for freezers. In snowy regions, food was sometimes packed in crates and left outside, carefully protected from animals. Ice was cut from rivers during winter, stored in sawdust or straw, and used in warmer months to keep milk or butter from spoiling. This ice trade, once common before electricity, reappeared in daily life during the war. Dairy products posed a special challenge. Milk spoiled quickly, so families boiled it to extend its life, or turned it into cheese and yogurt. These transformations not only saved food, but created variety in otherwise monotonous diets. Eggs, when available, were coated in a thin layer of oil or stored in lime water, keeping them fresh for weeks. Every method required patience, effort, and constant attention, as mistakes could mean illness. Neighbours often shared techniques, swapping jars of pickles for salted fish, building networks of exchange that kept more households secure. What is striking is how these practices revived cultural memory. Grandparents who remembered the pre-electric age taught younger generations, turning kitchens into classrooms. The act of preserving food was not only practical, but also deeply communal. Entire streets might smell of cabbage fermenting or wood smoke rising from backyard smokehouses. It was survival, but it was also identity, a reminder that even in wartime families could shape their own resilience. To live without refrigeration was to live with constant creativity, where every scrap had value and every tradition could mean the difference between waste and nourishment. Clean water, something often taken for granted in times of peace, became a daily struggle when electricity was no longer available. Pumps that once delivered water to homes and apartments stopped working during blackouts, leaving families to search for alternative sources. In cities, this meant long lines at public wells or fountains, where people waited with buckets, kettles, and pots. The sight of neighbours gathering at dawn, wrapped in coats and scarves, became a common rhythm of wartime life. In rural areas, wells were more accessible, but drawing water by hand was tiring and sometimes dangerous in winter, when ropes froze or ice formed at the edges. To make water safe, boiling became a universal ritual. Families gathered wood or coal to heat large pots, then carefully poured the boiled water into jars or ceramic containers. Without refrigerators, this boiled water had to be used quickly, which meant repeating the process every day. Tea kettles were rarely left unused, as they became both a source of warmth and a safeguard against illness. Where fuel was scarce, some households relied on cloth filters, sand, or even charcoal from stoves to remove dirt from water, hoping it would be clean enough to drink. Creativity extended further in communities where clean water sources were bombed or contaminated. Rainwater was collected in barrels placed under roof gutters, though this supply depended entirely on weather. Snow was melted in large pots, an especially common method in the Soviet Union or Scandinavia, though it yielded little compared to the effort required. Some families even reused laundry water for cleaning floors or flushing makeshift toilets, ensuring nothing went to waste. Hygiene posed its own challenges. Without running water, baths became a luxury. People learned to wash with bowls and cloths, often sharing the same small basin among several family members. Soap was scarce, so ash, baking soda, or homemade mixtures were used instead. Clothes were scrubbed by hand, dried by fires, and worn until patches upon patches became the norm. In urban shelters, where dozens of families crowded into damp basements, the absence of sanitation created risks of disease. Communities organised schedules for fetching water, ensuring each household got a fair share, and volunteers checked on the sick. Some women boiled large cauldrons of water for everyone, turning daily necessity into an act of solidarity. Even children contributed, carrying buckets that seemed almost too heavy for their arms, learning that survival meant effort from the youngest to the oldest. Despite the hardships, there were moments of resilience and even tenderness. A pot of boiled water was used not just for drinking, but for comfort, making a rare cup of herbal tea, or filling hot water bottles that warmed cold beds during winter nights. In this way, water connected people not only through struggle but also through care. The absence of electricity reminded civilians of how fragile modern systems were, but it also revealed their ability to adapt. Every drop was valued, every effort shared, and every sip reminded them that survival depended on patience, resourcefulness, and the quiet strength of community. Without electricity, communication became a fragile lifeline during the war. Families who once relied on telephones or radios suddenly found themselves cut off, forced to depend on slower, older methods. Letters became the most important form of staying connected. People wrote by candlelight, bending close to the page as shadows flickered across their faces. Ink was often stretched thin, paper reused, and envelopes crafted from scraps. A single letter carried more than words. It held reassurance, proof that someone was alive. Waiting for replies could take weeks, sometimes months. But the arrival of a letter brought relief stronger than any spoken promise. Radios, though limited, still played a role when batteries were available. Families rationed their use, turning them on only for short updates. A few minutes of crackling voices gave news from the front, warnings of air raids or rare musical broadcasts. In some places, neighbours gathered around one working set, leaning in close to catch every word. The radio became not just information, but community, a reminder that they were not entirely alone in the dark. Where radios failed, word of mouth filled the gap. Messengers, children, or even travelling workers carried news between towns and villages. In rural areas, church bells continued to serve as signals, marking danger or gathering times. Posters and handwritten announcements appeared on walls, guiding people toward ration points, shelters, or community meetings. Silence, however, was just as powerful. In occupied regions, civilians had to be cautious about what they shared. Conversations were often whispered, doors shut tightly, windows curtained even in daylight. Trust determined survival. A careless word could mean danger. Families developed unspoken codes, phrases in letters, signals and gestures that conveyed truth without drawing suspicion. Candlelit evenings gave space for stories. With news uncertain, people filled the silence with their own voices, retelling family history or reciting poetry. Communication was not only about passing information, but about preserving morale, keeping minds connected when the outside world felt distant. For children, lullabies and bedtime tales replaced the hum of radios or the flicker of cinema screens. They learned that words spoken by loved ones could be as steady as electricity once had been. Despite the slowness and fragility of these methods, communication without electricity carried a weight that modern speed often lacks. Each message, each story, was deliberate and cherished. In the absence of instant contact, civilians discovered the value of patience, of listening deeply, and of holding on to hope between each word that managed to reach them. Nighttime without electricity carried a unique weight during the war. When the sun dipped below the horizon, entire neighbourhoods slipped into deep shadow, broken only by the faint glow of candles or the distant shimmer of the moon. Darkness was no longer something casual. It became a companion, sometimes comforting, sometimes frightening. Civilians quickly learned that evening routines had to change. Families gathered earlier around the dinner table, knowing that cooking, cleaning and chores would be difficult once night fell. Children went to bed sooner, tucked beneath heavy blankets, while adults lingered by the fire or a single lamp, stretching precious moments of light as far as they could. Streets that once hummed with activity grew silent after dusk. Without lamps, alleys and corners felt unfamiliar, even threatening. People avoided unnecessary travel, and if they did step outside, they carried small lanterns with hoods to shield the flame. Often they relied on memory alone, walking the same routes by instinct, whispering to one another to stay calm. The stars above became guides. In rural areas, farmers taught their children to navigate by constellations, something few city dwellers had practiced before the war. The night sky, free from electric glow, revealed itself in astonishing clarity. For some it was a source of peace, proof that beauty endured even in hardship. For others, it was a reminder of how exposed they were beneath the vast silent heavens. Entertainment in the evenings had to adapt as well. Without radios running constantly or cinemas lit brightly, people turned inward. Card games, storytelling, and quiet songs filled the hours. A father might whittle wood by lamplight, while his children played simple board games. Neighbours sometimes gathered in one home to share light and warmth, the sound of laughter rising gently against the hush outside. Yet fear lingered too. Air raid sirens often broke the quiet of night, forcing families to grab their bundles and rush into basements or shelters. The sudden transition from peaceful silence to hurried footsteps in the dark was jarring. Candles were blown out quickly, leaving only the glow of a lantern hidden beneath cloth, meant to guide but not reveal. In those tense moments, children clutched their parents' hands tightly, hearts racing in rhythm with distant engines overhead. Still, civilians found ways to make the night bearable. Some created makeshift nightlights by placing glowing embers inside clay pots, giving off a faint orange glow that lasted until dawn. Others brewed warm drinks to calm nerves before sleep. Families whispered prayers, sang softly, or simply listened to the steady rhythm of each other's breathing. Darkness, though difficult, also offered a strange form of rest. Without electricity, there were fewer distractions, fewer demands to stay awake late into the night. People began to rise with the sun and sleep with its setting, rediscovering a rhythm as old as humanity itself. The absence of light, though born of hardship, reminded them that survival could be found in simplicity, through patience, togetherness, and the quiet resilience of enduring one more night. The absence of electricity changed the way civilians approached cooking in profound ways. Electric stoves, once a modern luxury in many homes, were replaced by open fires, coal ranges, or improvised outdoor pits. The act of preparing a meal became slower, heavier work, demanding constant attention and creativity. Wood had to be chopped, coal carefully rationed, and pots balanced over uneven flames. Families discovered that cooking was no longer about convenience, but about endurance. Meals were often simpler, made from ingredients that could last without refrigeration. Root vegetables such as potatoes, carrots, and turnips became staples, stored in cellars or buried in cool ground. Grains like barley and oats offered filling porridges, while beans and lentils, when available, stretched small amounts of meat into nourishing stews. Spices were rare, salt precious, so people relied on herbs grown in gardens or gathered from fields. The smell of boiling cabbage or beet soup drifted through many neighbourhoods, a quiet symbol of persistence in lean times. Improvisation was essential. Without ovens powered by electricity, baking bread required ingenuity. Some households built clay ovens in backyards, while others used cast iron pans over coals to create flatbreads. Cakes and pastries, once common in peacetime, became luxuries saved for rare occasions when ingredients could be gathered. Children often looked forward to these moments, when a neighbour might share a small sweet roll or a grandmother would bake something from memory, using whatever she had on hand. Fuel scarcity shaped every choice. Fires had to be lit carefully, often shared between neighbours to conserve resources. In some communities, a single large pot of soup simmered all day, with each family contributing what they could. These communal meals were not only practical but also comforting, turning hunger into an opportunity for solidarity. People learned to stretch every scrap. Bones boiled for broth, stale bread softened in soup, vegetable peels fried or pickled. Nothing was wasted, because nothing could be spared. Evening meals often became the heart of family life. Without electric lights, the glow of the fire or the flicker of a lantern framed the table. Families sat close, eating slowly, grateful for warmth and company as much as for the food itself. Conversations lingered, stories were told, and for a short while, the hardships outside seemed to fade. The act of cooking without electricity became more than survival. It was a way of preserving dignity, rhythm, and tradition. Old recipes resurfaced, passed down by memory when books or written notes were unavailable. Young people, who had grown used to electric kitchens, discovered the patience required to keep a fire steady, to stir constantly, to wait for flavours to develop. In the midst of war, these lessons shaped not only meals but character. Cooking without electricity was exhausting, unpredictable, and often monotonous, yet it taught resilience in small daily ways. Each meal was proof that families could adapt, that survival was possible, and that even in the darkest of times, the simple act of sharing food could kindle warmth in both body and spirit. The absence of electricity during the war also reshaped how civilians approached education and learning. Schools that once relied on electric lamps, heating, and even early projectors suddenly had to adapt to much older rhythms. Classrooms were often lit only by daylight streaming through tall windows, which meant lessons began early and ended sooner in the afternoon. On cloudy days, teachers struggled to keep children focused in dim rooms where writing on chalkboards was barely visible. Yet despite these challenges, education pressed on, for parents and teachers alike believed that maintaining routine and knowledge was as important as food and shelter. Children learned to write their assignments by candlelight at home, bending over small desks as wax dripped beside them. Ink froze in winter months, so some students used pencils until they became stubs. Paper was scarce, leading to the practice of reusing every sheet, writing in margins, erasing and copying over old notes. Even textbooks were shared among several children, passed from hand to hand with great care. Reading aloud became a central part of schooling, since not every child could see well in the dim light. Teachers encouraged students to memorize poems, historical dates, and mathematical tables, knowing that books might not always be available. Memory itself became a survival skill. In rural areas, classes sometimes took place outdoors when the weather allowed, where natural light and open air provided better conditions than cold, dark rooms. Education also moved into homes. Parents, especially those who remembered life before electricity, guided their children in practical learning, sewing, farming, repairing tools and cooking. These lessons were not always part of formal curricula, but they carried equal importance, preparing children for the demands of daily survival. At night, families often turned study into a communal activity. A single candle or lamp in the centre of the table lit the pages for everyone, siblings whispering words aloud as parents checked their work. In this way, learning became not just individual but collective, reinforcing bonds within households. War created constant disruptions, with bombings forcing schools to close or relocate into basements and shelters. Here, without electricity, children sat on the floor with slates or scraps of paper, while teachers spoke softly over the distant rumble outside. Even in such conditions, lessons gave a sense of normalcy. Parents later recalled how the sound of recited multiplication tables or poems steadied their nerves, reminding them that hope for the future still existed. The lack of electricity made education slower, more fragile, yet also deeply human. Children and adults alike discovered that learning could survive without machines, wires, or switches. What it required instead was patience, imagination, and determination. Knowledge passed hand to hand, voice to voice, became a quiet form of resistance against despair. Even in the darkest days, the pursuit of education glowed like a small flame, fragile yet unbroken. Healthcare without electricity during the war was among the greatest trials for civilians. Hospitals, already strained by shortages of medicine and staff, had to adapt quickly when power was cut or unreliable. Operating rooms that once depended on electric lamps turned to oil lanterns or candles, their unsteady glow casting long shadows over surgeons and patients alike. Doctors recalled the difficulty of performing delicate procedures with flickering light, relying on steady hands and the memory of their training. Sterilization was another challenge. Without electric sterilizers, instruments were boiled in large pots over coal or wood fires. This process took longer and required constant supervision, yet it was the only way to reduce infection. In makeshift clinics or field stations, glass jars of alcohol doubled as disinfectants, while cloth bandages were washed, dried, and reused countless times. Civilians learned to assist medical workers by preparing hot water, carrying fuel, or sewing clean linens, turning healthcare into a community effort. Refrigeration for medicine posed an even harsher obstacle. Insulin, vaccines, and certain antibiotics required cold storage, but without electricity, many supplies spoiled quickly. Doctors improvised by storing medicines in cellars, buried boxes, or containers surrounded by ice cut in winter. These methods were imperfect, but sometimes they bought enough time to save lives. For families, home remedies became essential. Herbal teas, poultices, and traditional practices resurfaced, passed down by elders who remembered life before modern medicine. Chamomile for calming, garlic for fighting colds, honey for wounds, all were used when pharmacies were empty. Though not always effective, these remedies gave hope and comfort. Hygiene in homes also became critical to survival. Without running water or electric pumps, families boiled water for washing wounds, scrubbed with homemade soap, and did their best to keep living spaces clean despite cramped conditions. Mothers were often the guardians of health, checking children for fevers, wrapping them in blankets, and preparing simple broths to keep up strength. Darkness added another layer of fear. At night, when a child fell ill or an elderly relative struggled to breathe, families had to fumble for candles or lanterns before care could even begin. The quiet of blacked-out towns amplified every sound of pain, every cough, reminding people how vulnerable they were without the safety net of electricity. Yet even in these harsh circumstances, resilience thrived. Neighbours checked on one another, midwives delivered babies by lamplight, and volunteers carried the injured through unlit streets to the nearest clinic. The absence of electricity revealed both the fragility and the strength of human care. Each act of healing, whether in a hospital or a modest home, became a testament to endurance. In the end, healthcare without electricity was not only about medicine, it was about compassion, resourcefulness, and the will to preserve life when everything else seemed uncertain. Entertainment without electricity became a quiet form of survival for civilians during the war. When radios could not be used regularly and cinemas were closed or dark, people returned to older traditions of passing time. Storytelling emerged as one of the most important ways to keep spirits alive. Parents told fairy tales and legends, grandparents shared memories of their own childhoods, and children created their own imaginative worlds, lit only by the glow of candles or the soft warmth of a fire. Words filled the silence where once music or broadcast had played. Music, however, never disappeared. Families sang together, sometimes accompanied by simple instruments like harmonicas, fiddles, or accordions that required no power. These small performances became treasured moments, breaking the heaviness of each day. Neighbours often gathered to share songs, the voices blending into a gentle reminder that even in darkness joy could still exist. Board games, card games, and puzzles provided quiet distractions as well. Many were handmade, drawn on scraps of paper or carved from wood. Children learned to play by lamplight, laughing softly while adults watched. The absence of electricity encouraged imagination. Dolls were sewn from rags, toy soldiers carved from sticks. These creations carried deeper meaning than store-bought toys, as they were crafted with care and kept as symbols of resilience. In rural villages, gatherings sometimes moved outdoors, where moonlight provided enough illumination for group activities. People recited poems, told ghost stories, or performed short plays, often improvised from memory. These events built community ties, giving civilians a sense of togetherness that helped ease the loneliness of war. In cities, entertainment often shifted to quieter forms. Reading by candlelight became a beloved ritual. Families passed books from hand to hand, and children leaned close to hear stories read aloud. Libraries, though under strain, remained important refuges during the day when natural light allowed for reading and study. The smell of old paper, the rustle of pages, these small details gave comfort in a world where so much was uncertain. Crafts also became a vital pastime. Women knitted socks and scarves, not only for their own families but also for soldiers at the front. Men carved wood, repaired furniture, or built toys. Hands kept busy meant minds stayed calmer, and the products of such work brought both practicality and comfort. Some even found joy in sketching by lantern light, capturing the faces of loved ones or the scenes of daily life that unfolded in the shadows. The silence of nights without electricity made these activities feel more intimate. Laughter carried softly. Songs seemed warmer, and every shared story lingered longer. Entertainment was not about distraction alone. It was about preserving humanity when the outside world felt cold and harsh. In these moments, civilians discovered that happiness could be crafted without machines, screens, or power. What mattered most was presence, the closeness of family, the sound of voices, and the steady comfort of traditions reborn in the darkest of times. Transportation was another daily challenge when electricity could not be relied upon. Trains and trams, once symbols of modern progress, often slowed or stopped entirely during wartime shortages. Blackouts made rail stations dangerous to operate at night, so schedules shifted to daylight hours whenever possible. Civilians adjusted by waking earlier, planning trips around limited services, and learning to accept long delays. In many cities, electric trams were replaced by horse-drawn carts or buses running on scarce fuel. Walking became the most dependable method of getting anywhere, and people grew used to travelling miles on foot each day. Shoes wore down quickly, so cobblers were in constant demand. Old leather was patched and repatched, wooden soles nailed on to extend their life. For children, hand-me-down shoes became a necessity, often several sizes too big or too small. Bicycles grew more valuable than gold. Without electricity and with little fuel, bikes became the fastest and most efficient way to move. Families passed them down carefully, repairing tyres with scraps of rubber or cloth. It was common to see entire streets filled with people cycling, balancing baskets of food or bundles of firewood. Neighbours sometimes shared one bicycle between several households, arranging times when each person could use it. In rural areas, carts pulled by donkeys or oxen carried goods, while city dwellers pushed heavy wheelbarrows loaded with coal, water, or food. Roads were often dark and uneven, especially during blackouts, so people moved slowly, guided by memory and the faint glow of the moon. Travel at night carried risks, not only from accidents, but from air raids. Many chose to stay home after dusk, saving their strength for daytime work. For long-distance journeys, trains still played a role, but overcrowding and slow speeds made them exhausting. Civilians often stood for hours in unlit carriages, huddled together against the cold. Windows were blacked out, and the rhythmic clatter of wheels in the dark reminded passengers how vulnerable they were. Yet even here, small kindnesses emerged. Strangers shared food, told stories, and kept watch for one another's belongings. The absence of electricity taught people to plan carefully. A simple errand required thought about distance, timing, and safety. Mothers sent children to school in groups, workers left for jobs earlier, and families coordinated tasks so that no one wasted energy. Travel was no longer convenient, but it became deliberate, shaped by patience and resilience. Despite the hardship, there was also a strange return to older rhythms. Walking through quiet streets, hearing only footsteps and horse hooves, reminded many of the earlier times. The war had stripped away machines and lights, but it had not taken away determination. Civilians learned to move forward, slowly, steadily, and together, even when the world around them had gone dark. Workplaces without electricity faced daily tests of adaptation. Factories, offices, and workshops that once depended on machines or lighting had to slow their pace or change methods entirely. In industrial towns, blackout regulations meant production often shifted to daylight hours, but even then, machinery powered by electricity could not always run. Workers turned back to hand tools, relying on strength and endurance rather than speed. It was tiring, but it kept goods moving when the war demanded constant output. Offices faced their own challenges. Without lights, clerks pressed desks against windows, filling ledgers and writing reports by the glow of natural light. On cloudy days, productivity dropped sharply, yet workers persisted, adjusting to shorter hours. Typewriters, while useful, required no electricity, so they became essential tools once again. The rhythm of clacking keys echoed in dim rooms, reminding people that work continued even under constraint. Workshops and small businesses were forced into creativity. Bakers, without electric ovens, used coal-fired or wood-fired models, learning to adjust recipes for uneven heat. Tailors stitched clothes by lamplight, and carpenters shaped wood by hand, sometimes with tools handed down from grandparents. These trades became lifelines for communities, offering goods and services that could not be mass-produced under blackout conditions. In larger industries, the absence of power meant reorganizing tasks. Heavy machinery sat idle while workers focused on jobs that required manual labor, sorting, carrying, or assembling. Factories echoed less with the hum of machines and more with the sound of voices and footsteps. This slower pace was frustrating, yet it also strengthened cooperation, as workers leaned on each other to keep production alive. Night shifts nearly disappeared. Few employers risked accidents or attacks in unlit buildings, so civilians adjusted their routines, waking earlier to maximize daylight. Candle use in workplaces was limited for safety, as one accident could destroy precious supplies. Instead, families contributed by finishing tasks at home, sewing uniforms, rolling bandages, or assembling small parts. Work and home life blurred together, with everyone contributing what they could. The absence of electricity also brought a renewed respect for craftsmanship. A shoemaker repairing boots by hand, or a blacksmith hammering metal without modern machines, embodied a skill that war could not erase. These crafts kept communities clothed, fed, and equipped, proving that even in the darkest times, human hands could accomplish what wires and switches could not. For civilians, work without electricity was exhausting, slower, and often frustrating, but it also revealed resilience. Every ledger filled, every loaf baked, every garment stitched was a quiet victory against hardship. In dim rooms and smoky workshops, people discovered that determination could outshine the absence of light. Religious life without electricity carried a quiet but powerful presence during the war. Churches, synagogues, and meeting halls often stood in darkness, their stained glass windows blacked out to prevent enemy bombers from spotting them. Services were moved to daytime whenever possible, but when evening gatherings were held, they took place by candlelight. The dim glow transformed sacred spaces into places of deep intimacy, where whispered prayers rose gently above the silence outside. For many civilians, faith became a steady anchor, when everything else seemed uncertain. Without electric bells or loudspeakers, communities relied on human voices to call the faithful. A priest or rabbi would walk through the streets, knocking on doors, reminding families of service times. Word of mouth replaced schedules, and people often walked together in groups, guiding one another along darkened roads. The simple act of gathering became an expression of courage, as fear of raids or patrols was always present. Inside, the absence of electricity reshaped rituals. Hymns were sung softly, candles placed carefully to avoid shadows escaping through windows. The flicker of light on faces gave worship a new weight, as if each participant carried part of the flame within. In small villages, barns or private homes doubled as chapels, where neighbours prayed together, sometimes seated on wooden crates or benches. These gatherings often blurred the line between formal worship and daily life, creating a sense of shared resilience. Religious holidays were especially poignant. Without electric lights, Christmas trees were decorated with handmade ornaments and lit with a few carefully watched candles. Hanukkah celebrations glowed with the light of oil lamps, reminding families of perseverance across centuries. Easter, Ramadan, and other observances carried renewed meaning, as traditions practiced in darkness highlighted the endurance of faith. Even funerals and memorials adapted. Services often took place in daylight, but when night ceremonies were necessary, torches or lanterns lined the way. In these moments, grief and faith intertwined, the darkness surrounding mourners echoing the weight of loss while the small flames symbolized hope. For children, religious gatherings offered both comfort and memory. Many recalled the sound of voices joined in song, the warmth of candlelit prayers, and the sense that, even in wartime, they belonged to something larger than fear. Elders took care to explain traditions, passing down stories and beliefs as much as rituals themselves. Faith without electricity reminded civilians that light did not only come from switches or wires, it came from community, memory, and belief. In the darkest times, the quiet strength of prayer and song became a source of courage, carrying families through nights when survival seemed uncertain, but hope still burned steadily. Markets and trade without electricity became a world of improvisation. In towns and villages, stalls once lit by electric lamps were instead arranged around daylight hours, with business slowing dramatically once the sun set. Sellers relied on candles, lanterns, or even open torches when they absolutely needed to work in the evening, but shadows made transactions difficult. As a result, most trade shifted to mornings and afternoons, when natural light allowed customers to see the goods clearly. Fresh food was the heart of these markets. Without refrigeration, vendors sold vegetables, bread, and meat quickly, knowing that items would spoil if left unsold. Families learned to shop daily rather than weekly, carrying baskets to buy only what they could cook and eat before it went bad. This rhythm created crowded mornings, as neighbours filled streets early to secure rations. Long lines became a part of everyday life, winding past darkened storefronts, with people chatting quietly to pass the time. Bartering returned as an important part of survival. Civilians traded jars of preserved vegetables for pieces of fabric, firewood for eggs, or soap for candles. Money still had value, but shortages meant that personal goods sometimes became more useful than coins. Skilled workers often exchanged services, repairing shoes or tailoring clothes in return for food. The absence of electricity made these markets resemble scenes from centuries past, where trust and negotiation carried as much weight as currency. Shops also adapted. Store owners opened their doors wide to let in daylight, arranging items near windows to catch the sun. Without electric cash registers, transactions were written by hand in ledgers. Weights and measures, rather than scales powered by electricity, were used to ensure fairness. Customers often brought their own containers, jars, or cloth bags, since packaging was scarce. Shopping became slower but more personal, each exchange marked by conversation and patience. Travelling traders carried goods from village to village, sometimes on bicycles or horse-drawn carts. Their arrival was greeted with anticipation, as they brought items otherwise unavailable: salt, sugar, or small luxuries like sewing needles. In return, they left with local produce, ensuring that supplies circulated despite wartime restrictions. These traders connected communities, serving as both merchants and messengers, carrying news along with goods. Even in cities under blackout, markets provided a sense of normalcy. Though dim and quiet, they gave civilians the comfort of routine: the smell of bread, the chatter of neighbours, the act of choosing food for supper. In this way, markets without electricity became more than places of trade. They were social spaces, reminders that life continued, and proof that even in darkness, human connection could keep communities alive. Childcare without electricity demanded patience, creativity, and constant vigilance. For parents, the greatest challenge was keeping children safe and calm in a world that suddenly seemed darker, colder, and more fragile. At night, the absence of electric lights often frightened young ones, who were used to lamps or radios keeping shadows at bay. Mothers and fathers improvised with small lanterns or homemade night lights, sometimes placing glowing embers inside clay pots to provide a soft glow until morning. These simple comforts eased fear, helping children fall asleep in crowded shelters or unfamiliar basements. Daily routines shifted heavily around daylight. Without electric lamps, homework had to be finished before dusk, and playtime moved outdoors where natural light was abundant. Children learned quickly that chores were not optional. They helped gather firewood, fetch water, or peel vegetables, often under the guidance of grandparents who remembered similar times from their own youth. Work became a form of learning, teaching responsibility in ways no classroom could. Entertainment for children was also transformed. With no electric toys or constant radio programs, games became simpler but no less joyful. Marbles, hopscotch, hide-and-seek, and hand-clapping songs filled courtyards and gardens. Parents and older siblings crafted dolls from cloth, carved animals from wood, or stitched balls from scraps of leather. These handmade toys carried stories, becoming symbols of family resilience. When nights fell, storytelling replaced screens. Parents recited folk tales or made up adventures, voices weaving comfort through the stillness. In many families, these nightly rituals became cherished memories, proving that imagination could glow brighter than electricity ever had. Safety was always at the forefront of childcare. Candles and stoves posed constant risks, so children were taught early to keep distance from open flames. Parents placed barriers around fires and trained little ones to recognize danger. In shelters during air raids, mothers often carried small bags packed with blankets, toys, and bits of food to distract and soothe their children. Older siblings took on protective roles, holding hands and guiding the younger through darkened streets. Nutrition too required care. With limited food preservation, parents worked hard to provide warm meals, often stretching rations to feed growing bodies. Soups and porridges, though plain, offered comfort and sustenance. Families celebrated even small treats, an apple, a piece of chocolate, or a spoonful of jam, as if they were feasts. These moments reminded children that joy could exist even in scarcity. Childhood in a world without electricity was not easy, yet it carried lessons of resilience, patience, and imagination. For many, it shaped memories of closeness, sitting around a candle, hearing a story, or sharing a simple meal. Parents, despite exhaustion, found ways to create safety and warmth, proving that even in the darkest times, love itself could be the brightest light. Community gatherings without electricity became lifelines of morale during the war. With cinemas closed at night, radios limited, and lights extinguished after dusk, people turned toward each other for comfort and strength. Villages organised small assemblies in barns, schools, or open fields, carefully timed to daylight hours. In towns under blackout, neighbours crowded into a single house, bringing candles or oil lamps, pooling resources to share warmth and companionship. These gatherings were not elaborate, but they carried deep meaning, reminding civilians that hardship could be eased by togetherness. Music often served as the centerpiece. Someone with a violin, accordion, or harmonica could transform a dim room into a place of joy. Families sang familiar songs, voices rising softly in harmony, the sound blending with the crackle of a stove or the faint hiss of a lantern. Even those who could not sing joined in clapping or tapping feet. For a brief while, music replaced silence, giving people courage to endure. Storytelling also flourished. Elders shared folk tales, legends, or stories of their own youth before electricity was common, teaching children both history and resilience. Neighbours recounted local news, sometimes mixing humour with hardship, turning shared struggles into moments of laughter. In basements and shelters, these stories were often whispered, yet they still carried the power to comfort. Food was another reason for gatherings. Communities organised collective meals, each family contributing whatever they could. Potatoes, beans, bread, or pickled vegetables. A single large pot of stew could feed dozens, stretching limited supplies while creating a sense of unity. Eating together under the glow of a few candles reminded people that survival was not only about nourishment, but about solidarity. Religious and cultural traditions were preserved in these gatherings as well. Holiday celebrations, stripped of electric lights or decorations, were marked by handmade ornaments, songs, and rituals performed by memory. These events reassured children that life still held rhythm and meaning, even if it looked different. Adults found comfort too, drawing strength from rituals that stretched back generations. Safety remained a constant concern. Gatherings had to be discreet, especially in occupied regions, where noise or visible light could attract danger. Windows were covered, voices kept low, and candles shielded carefully. Yet the very act of meeting became an expression of quiet defiance, proof that community ties could not be extinguished. For many civilians, these gatherings were more than distraction. They were survival. They gave hope, strengthened friendships, and provided relief from the solitude of darkened homes. In a world without electricity, human connection became the brightest source of light, carrying people through nights that otherwise might have felt endless. News and information without electricity became fragile threads that tied civilians to the wider world. When radios could only be used sparingly, and newspapers struggled to print under shortages, people depended on whatever sources they could find. In many cities, handwritten notices were posted on walls or in central squares, often listing ration changes, warnings, or local announcements. Civilians gathered around these boards, reading together and whispering interpretations because every detail mattered. Rumours travelled quickly in such an environment. A single piece of gossip shared in a market line could spread across neighbourhoods in a day, sometimes offering hope, other times deepening fear. Without reliable electricity to power radios consistently, families clung to brief broadcasts when batteries allowed. They turned on sets for only a few minutes, straining to catch official updates before turning them off again to conserve power. In households lucky enough to still receive international broadcasts, voices crackling across the airwaves carried enormous weight, giving civilians glimpses of events beyond their darkened streets. Printed newspapers, when available, became treasures. People passed copies from hand to hand, reading them by daylight or candlelight. Whole families gathered around a single page, with someone reading aloud to others. Old newspapers were never thrown away casually. They lined drawers, wrapped belongings, or even fueled stoves once their news had been memorized. Still, the act of reading them together created shared memory, binding households to the larger story of the war. Couriers and travelling traders often doubled as carriers of news. A man arriving from another village might bring tales of battles, shortages, or relative safety in nearby towns. His words, though not always accurate, gave civilians a sense of connection, a reminder that their struggles were not isolated. Churches and schools also played roles in spreading information, with announcements delivered after services or at the start of lessons. In occupied territories, secrecy became essential. Hidden radios, often buried in basements or disguised in walls, carried forbidden broadcasts. Families risked punishment to listen, gathering in silence, curtains drawn, every ear straining to catch each faint word. The tension was high, but the knowledge gained gave hope that truth still existed beyond propaganda. For children, the way news was shared left lasting impressions. They remembered parents leaning close to whisper, neighbours knocking quietly to pass along updates, or siblings repeating memorised headlines. Even without electricity, the flow of information never stopped. It only slowed, transformed into fragile but determined networks. News in those days was not instant, but it was cherished. Every word mattered, every detail carried weight, and in the absence of bright screens or constant broadcasts, civilians discovered how deeply human it felt to share information directly, voice to voice, face to face, in the glow of a single candle. Clothing and laundry without electricity demanded constant effort and ingenuity. Washing machines were rare even before the war, but for those who had them, blackouts quickly rendered them useless. Instead, families returned to manual labour, scrubbing clothes on washboards, soaking them in basins, and boiling linens in large pots over coal or wood fires. The process was exhausting, yet essential, because hygiene had to be maintained to prevent illness. Water was fetched from wells or pumps, heated carefully and carried in heavy buckets. Soap, in short supply, was stretched by mixing with ash, soda, or even grated slivers from old bars. Clothes were wrung out by hand, then hung to dry on lines strung across courtyards, balconies, or even inside homes during winter. In crowded cities, streets sometimes filled with sheets and garments fluttering in the daylight, a small sign of normalcy amidst hardship. Repairing clothing was just as important as washing it. With no steady supply of new fabric, people patched and repatched garments until little of the original material remained. Socks were darned repeatedly, coats lined with scraps of old blankets, and children often wore outfits that had passed through several siblings. Thread itself was precious, saved from unravelling old items, while buttons were removed from worn-out clothes to be used again. In rural areas, women spun wool or flax into yarn, knitting sweaters, scarves and mittens by lantern light. These items were not only practical, but also symbols of care, as many were sent to soldiers at the front. Old curtains or sheets were cut into dresses or shirts, and creativity often replaced fashion. People wore what was available, focusing on warmth and durability over appearance. Drying laundry posed its own difficulties. Without electric dryers, families relied on sun, wind, and fire. In winter, frozen shirts and trousers stiffened like boards before eventually thawing indoors. Children sometimes found amusement in this, laughing at frozen garments while mothers sighed at the slow process. The smell of smoke often clung to clean clothes, as fires were used for drying in damp shelters. Footwear, too, was a constant concern. Shoes wore down quickly with so much walking, so cobblers became essential. When leather was scarce, soles were patched with wood or rubber scraps. Families shared boots, alternating use depending on who needed to travel that day. In extreme cases, civilians wrapped their feet in cloth and string, creating makeshift protection against the cold. Clothing without electricity was not about style, but about survival. Each stitch, each wash, carried with it the weight of endurance. Families learned to value what they had, to extend the life of every garment, and to find pride in keeping their loved ones clothed and warm. In the absence of modern convenience, laundry and clothing became daily lessons in patience, resilience, and the quiet strength of making do with less. Safety without electricity became a constant concern for civilians during the war. Darkness that once seemed ordinary now carried risks, both from accidents inside the home and dangers outside in the streets. Families learned quickly that a simple candle could cause disaster if left unattended. Parents taught children strict rules: never play near flames, never run while holding a lantern, always keep water nearby in case of fire. Small basins filled with sand or water often stood in corners, ready to smother sparks. Despite these precautions, accidents happened, and neighbours rushed to help one another when flames threatened to spread through crowded housing. Streets without light also tested caution. Cobblestones were uneven, potholes deep, and without lamps to guide the way, people stumbled often. Elderly civilians carried sticks to feel their path, while younger children clung tightly to parents' hands. Community patrols sometimes walked together at night, carrying hooded lanterns to escort groups safely home. The blackout was not only for protection from bombers, but also a daily hazard civilians had to navigate. In bomb shelters, safety took on a different meaning. With no electricity, basements filled with damp air, and lanterns burned low, families squeezed close, trying not to trip over belongings in the dark. Volunteers often served as guides, calling out instructions softly and making sure no one was left behind. Whispered reminders: step slowly, hold the wall, stay together, became as vital as the walls themselves. Safety also meant protection from crime. The cover of darkness sometimes encouraged theft or smuggling. Neighbours formed small watch groups, listening for suspicious movement in alleyways. Trust became essential. A familiar knock at the door or a known voice was safer than any key. Communities often developed their own signals, quiet ways of saying it's safe or be careful without alerting strangers. Inside homes, families adapted their spaces to prevent accidents. Furniture was rearranged to clear walking paths, especially near stoves or lanterns. Sharp objects were stored carefully, and heavy curtains kept flames hidden from the outside. Even bedtime carried rituals of safety. Candles blown out, embers covered, doors checked twice. These small acts, repeated nightly, gave civilians a sense of control in uncertain times. Safety without electricity was never guaranteed, but it was carefully built through routine, vigilance, and community effort. People learned to move slowly, to trust each other, and to see the value in even the simplest precaution. In the quiet dark of wartime, safety was not just about survival. It was about creating calm, protecting hope, and ensuring that families could endure another night together. Leisure without electricity took on a slower, more thoughtful character during the war. When the hum of radios was silenced and theatres stood empty after dusk, civilians turned to pastimes that required nothing more than their own hands and imagination. Reading became one of the most common escapes. Families gathered by daylight to flip through worn books, and when the sun faded, stories were read aloud by candlelight. The rhythm of a parent's voice or the soft murmur of a sibling sharing chapters created warmth in the coldest evenings. Books were treasured objects, passed among neighbours, traded for food, or borrowed from libraries that struggled to remain open during the day. Writing, too, offered a quiet form of leisure. People kept journals, recording not only daily struggles but also reflections, poems, and sketches. In the absence of electric distraction, the simple act of setting thoughts on paper gave a sense of order to the chaos outside. For many, these notebooks later became precious records of resilience. Handicrafts filled many hours. Knitting, embroidery, or wood carving were both useful and calming. Scarves, mittens, or carved toys were produced in dimly lit rooms, each item carrying the imprint of patience. Children helped by winding yarn or sanding wood, learning that leisure could be productive. These crafts also doubled as gifts, tokens of affection, in a time when shop shelves were often bare. Outdoor leisure still found its place. Without electric lights, evenings encouraged early rest, but daylight hours allowed walks, games, and small gatherings. Children played marbles or tag in courtyards, while adults found comfort in tending gardens or repairing tools. Even simple activities, like listening to birdsong or watching the clouds, took on greater significance in a world slowed by necessity. Music remained a treasured source of relief. Families sang softly, sometimes accompanied by instruments that needed no electricity. A harmonica's melody, or the steady strum of a guitar, could fill the silence with comfort. In larger communities, small concerts were held during the day, offering moments of joy and togetherness. These events reminded civilians that beauty and creativity could not be erased by war. Leisure also became spiritual in its own way. With no glowing screens or busy nightlife, people reflected more deeply, prayed quietly, or simply sat in silence with loved ones. These moments, though simple, carried strength. They allowed civilians to pause, to breathe, and to remember life beyond hardship. Leisure without electricity was not about distraction or speed. It was about presence, being with family, creating with one's hands, or resting the mind in stillness. Though stripped of convenience, it revealed the quiet resilience of finding peace in the smallest acts, even as the world beyond remained uncertain. Agriculture without electricity became the backbone of survival for many civilians. Farms that once benefited from electric pumps, tractors, or simple machinery had to return almost entirely to manual labour. Fields were ploughed with horses or oxen, while families, including children, worked long hours with hand tools. The absence of electric irrigation system meant reliance on rainfall, wells, and rivers, requiring careful planning of crops. Farmers studied the sky, watched the seasons closely, and prayed for balance in weather, because one poor harvest could mean hunger for an entire village. Storage of crops also changed drastically. Without electric silos or cooling systems, grains were dried in the sun and stored in sacks or wooden bins. Root vegetables were buried in pits lined with straw, protected from frost through the winter. Families guarded these supplies carefully, checking them often for rot or pests. Sharing among neighbours was common, as one family's surplus of potatoes might be traded for another's supply of beans or apples. The rhythm of farm life shifted toward natural light. Work began at dawn, when visibility was best, and ended as the sun sank. Evenings were spent repairing tools, weaving baskets, or preserving food for the months ahead. Without electric lamps, fields could not be worked late into the night, so efficiency during the day was vital. Despite exhaustion, the cycle brought a sense of order that many found grounding amidst the chaos of war. Urban families often relied on small gardens, sometimes planted in courtyards, vacant lots, or even bomb-damaged plots of land. These victory gardens, though modest, supplied vegetables that eased dependence on rations. Children learned to water, weed, and harvest, proud of their contribution. Every carrot pulled from the soil, every cabbage saved felt like a triumph. Fuel shortages also meant creative use of animals. Donkeys, oxen, and even dogs helped carry goods or pull carts. In villages, communal threshing or milling returned, with neighbours gathering to process grains together. Such labour, though heavy, created solidarity. Songs were often sung during harvest, voices rising in rhythm with swinging scythes, lifting spirits as much as cutting crops. The absence of electricity highlighted the fragility of supply chains. Cities depended on rural farms more than ever, and transport delays often left markets bare. Farmers took pride in knowing their work fed not only their families but entire communities. Yet this pride was mixed with fear, as fields were vulnerable to raids, bombings, or requisition. Still, agriculture without electricity proved that survival was possible when people leaned on older methods. It was slower, harsher, and more uncertain, but it connected civilians deeply to the earth. Each seed planted and each harvest gathered carried hope, a reminder that even in war, life continued to grow from the soil beneath their feet. Seasonal change without electricity demanded constant adaptation from civilians. Summer brought long days filled with work, but also the chance to rely on natural light for nearly all tasks. Families rose early, making the most of every hour of sunshine, and children played outdoors until dusk. Food preservation reached its busiest pace in summer and autumn. Vegetables dried in the open air, fruits were preserved in jars, and herbs hung from rafters to cure. The warmth helped, but it also meant food spoiled faster, requiring vigilance. Flies and insects were a nuisance, so families covered dishes with cloths or stored them in cool cellars. Without refrigerators, nothing could be left out for long. Autumn carried both relief and urgency. Harvests filled pantries, yet the shadow of winter loomed. Families worked tirelessly to store potatoes, apples, and grains, building hidden reserves. Firewood was gathered and stacked high, every piece representing survival for the months ahead. Clothing was patched again, ensuring enough layers for the cold season. Neighbours often helped one another, exchanging labour in the fields for a share of the harvest. Winter was the harshest. Darkness lingered for most of the day, and without electric heaters, homes grew bitterly cold. Fires had to be kept alive, water melted from snow, and every candle was precious. Families often stayed in a single room, huddled together under blankets. Laundry froze on the lines, and even simple chores became exhausting. Yet winter also fostered closeness, with long nights spent telling stories, singing or knitting by firelight. Spring brought a mixture of hope and struggle. Melting snow often flooded homes or roads, making travel difficult. Food reserves ran thin, leaving many on short rations until gardens began to grow again. Yet the sight of green shoots breaking through the soil brought encouragement, a sign that hardship would ease. Spring cleaning carried deeper meaning, repairing homes damaged by storms, washing away soot, and preparing gardens for planting. The rhythm of seasons guided life more powerfully than ever before. Civilians adjusted sleep, meals, and chores around the sun and weather, rediscovering a harmony with nature that had been dimmed by electricity. Each change of season brought new trials, but also new chances for resilience. In the cycle of light and dark, warmth and cold, people found strength to keep moving forward. Survival became not just a matter of endurance, but of learning to live in step with the natural world, trusting its patterns even in times of uncertainty. Shelter without electricity became both a challenge and a symbol of resilience for civilians. Homes, already strained by shortages and bombings, had to function without the comfort of steady light or warmth. Families adapted by reorganizing their living spaces. Rooms closest to the kitchen or stove became central gathering places, while unused areas were sealed off with blankets or boards to conserve heat. Windows were covered not only for blackout rules but also to keep in warmth, using heavy cloth, cardboard, or even old rugs. Basements and cellars, once storage spaces, were converted into shelters. They were dark, damp, and often crowded, but they offered protection from air raids. Families brought down mattresses, blankets, and jars of food, turning these underground spaces into temporary homes. Children decorated the walls with drawings to make them less frightening, while adults placed small lamps or candles in safe corners. The absence of electricity made these shelters eerie, yet they were lifelines when sirens wailed overhead. Improvised shelters appeared everywhere. Some civilians dug trenches and gardens, covering them with boards and earth to create crude bunkers. Others transformed barns, sheds, or even caves into hiding places. Neighbours often worked together, pooling resources to build stronger communal shelters. These efforts required constant maintenance, as dampness threatened supplies and cold air seeped through cracks. Creativity and cooperation were the only tools available. Safety inside shelters was carefully managed. Candles were rationed, flames shielded to prevent smoke from filling the air. Families kept buckets of water or sand nearby in case of fire. Sleeping arrangements were tight, with several people sharing one mattress or pile of blankets. Privacy was non-existent, yet the closeness gave comfort during nights filled with distant explosions. Daily life in these shelters carried routines. Mothers prepared simple meals over small stoves, children whispered games, and elders told stories to pass the time. The glow of even a single lantern turned the darkness into something bearable. Outside of raids, shelters doubled as storage for food, fuel, and water, ensuring essentials were safe from sudden attacks. For those who lost their homes entirely, shelters became permanent dwellings. Abandoned buildings were repurposed, with civilians using salvaged wood, bricks, and fabric to rebuild what little they could. Without electricity, survival in these spaces demanded ingenuity. Hanging lanterns from hooks, using mirrors to reflect light, and arranging living spaces around fire or daylight. Shelter without electricity was never comfortable, but it carried a sense of endurance. Every blanket hung, every candle lit, every wall reinforced was proof that civilians refused to surrender to the darkness. These spaces, though fragile, became sanctuaries where families found strength together, waiting for dawn to bring another chance at survival. Medicine at home without electricity became a necessity for civilians, especially when hospitals were overcrowded or far away. Families relied on remedies passed down through generations, blending folk knowledge with whatever supplies could be found. Herbs were gathered from fields and gardens, chamomile for fevers, mint for stomach pains, garlic for colds and honey for wounds. These treatments were not always strong enough, but they gave comfort and hope when professional care was out of reach. Kitchens often doubled as pharmacies. Mothers dried leaves and roots on windowsills, storing them in jars or cloth bags. Teas were brewed over stoves or open fires, their warmth offering both relief and reassurance. Poultices made from mashed herbs or bread were applied to cuts and bruises, while saltwater rinses treated sore throats. Simple practices like boiling water for cleanliness or airing out bedding became vital for preventing illness in a world without modern sanitation. Pain relief was limited. Aspirin and other medicines were scarce, so civilians turned to natural substitutes or endured discomfort quietly. Sleep, rest, and warmth were treated as medicines themselves, with families wrapping the sick in layers of blankets and placing hot stones or bottles near their feet. Neighbours often shared what little they had, trading herbs, bandages, or precious tablets of medicine. Knowing that cooperation could mean survival, childbirth presented particular risks. Without electric lights or equipment, midwives relied on oil lamps and their own skill. They sterilised tools by boiling them, used clean cloths for swaddling, and guided mothers through labour with calm voices. Despite the danger, countless children were safely delivered in these conditions, thanks to the knowledge and courage of women who carried traditions of care. Injuries from daily life were common, especially with open flames and heavy labour. Burns from stoves, cuts from tools, and accidents in the dark demanded constant attention. Families learned to act quickly, cooling wounds with water, binding them with cloth, and monitoring for infection. Without refrigeration, ointments and poultices had to be prepared fresh, adding to the daily burden of care. Even mental health found its remedies. In a world without distraction from electricity, families leaned on conversation, prayer, and storytelling to calm anxiety. Gentle routines, herbal teas at night, a parent humming to a child, or an elder recounting hopeful tales acted as medicine for the spirit. While home remedies could not replace hospitals, they provided resilience and comfort. Medicine without electricity was as much about resourcefulness as it was about healing. Every jar of dried herbs, every whispered lullaby, every act of neighbourly sharing became part of a vast, quiet effort to keep communities alive. In the face of scarcity, care itself became the strongest cure. Letters and diaries without electricity became the quiet record of civilian life during the war. With no instant communication and only rare use of radios, writing became the way people preserved memory, shared feelings, and reached out across distances. Families sat by candlelight, carefully forming words on paper that carried both hope and longing. A simple letter could take weeks or months to reach its destination, yet the act of writing it was an act of resilience, a reminder that bonds still endured. Diaries were often kept in secret, hidden under mattresses or tucked away in boxes. Children and adults alike recorded their daily struggles. The sound of planes overhead, the taste of a rare meal, the fear of dark nights. Without electricity, evenings were quiet, giving space for reflection. The scratch of a pen, the glow of a lantern, and the stillness of the room made writing almost meditative. These pages captured the emotions of war in ways no official report could. Letters were treated as treasures. When a postman arrived, entire households gathered in anticipation. A folded sheet of paper, creased and smudged, was read aloud again and again until every word was memorized. Some families pinned letters to walls as reminders of absent loved ones. Others carried them in pockets, taking comfort in their weight. Even when news was short or vague, the presence of handwriting gave strength. Stationery was scarce, so people grew inventive. Margins of old newspapers, scraps of wrapping paper, or even the backs of ration forms were used. Ink was diluted to stretch further, pencils worn down to stubs. Envelopes were sometimes handmade, sealed with wax or string. These imperfections did not lessen the value. If anything, they made the letters more precious. Diaries, too, were not only about recording facts. many became places of dreams and imagination. Civilians wrote poems, drew sketches, or described moments of beauty they noticed: a bird on a windowsill, children laughing in the street, or the glow of firelight on familiar faces. These entries gave balance to the hardships, showing that life still held small joys. For children, diaries were both comfort and secret friend. They confided fears, described games, and expressed hope for better days. Parents often encouraged this practice, knowing it gave their children a sense of control in uncertain times. For adults, writing became a way to endure grief or to remind themselves of identity beyond survival. Letters and diaries without electricity were fragile, easily lost to fire, damp, or war itself. Yet many survived, and today they serve as powerful voices from the past. They remind us that even when light was gone and silence heavy, civilians still found ways to speak, to themselves, to their loved ones, and to the future they hoped would come. Timekeeping without electricity shaped the rhythm of every civilian's day. Alarm clocks that once rang with precision fell silent, and wristwatches powered by winding became prized possessions. Families who owned one often shared it, passing it between members to keep track of hours. Those without relied on nature itself. The rising and setting of the sun became the clearest markers, while the call of roosters, the tolling of church bells, or even the habits of neighbours served as signals of time passing. In towns, factories and schools tried to keep regular schedules, but without electric bells, workers and children often depended on whistles or hand-rung bells. Farmers, already accustomed to natural cycles, guided others with their steady routines. Fields tilled at dawn, livestock fed at regular intervals, and produce brought to market as the sun climbed higher. Civilians who lived nearby used these patterns to measure their own days. Candle use also became a kind of clock. A burning candle might be marked at intervals, each line representing a portion of an hour. Families learned to judge how long a candle would last and adjusted their tasks accordingly. Some even carved notches into wood or used dripping wax as a reminder of passing time. It was an imprecise system, but in the absence of electricity it gave structure to long nights. Sundials, once thought of as relics, were rediscovered. In gardens and courtyards, people set up simple versions using sticks and stones. Watching the shadow move across the ground reminded them of ancient ways of living, connecting the present to generations who had survived without machines. In shelters or basements, time often blurred. Families would lose track of hours during raids, relying on the sound of footsteps above or the fading of lanterns to sense when night had passed. This timelessness was unsettling, yet it also taught patience. Without constant reminders of minutes ticking by, people began to live more in the moment, focusing on tasks at hand rather than the precise hour. Waiting became a common part of life, waiting for letters, for food, for the end of sirens, and time itself seemed to stretch and fold. Children adapted quickly, inventing their own systems. They counted heartbeats, footsteps, or songs to measure short intervals. Games often doubled as clocks, with a rhyme lasting until supper, or a round of marbles filling an hour. These playful methods helped them accept the uncertainty adults often found frustrating. Time without electricity was slower, less exact, but also strangely grounding. It reminded civilians that the world had once moved by natural rhythms alone, and that survival did not depend on precision, but on persistence. Each sunrise brought another chance to endure, and each sunset marked one more day survived. Travel beyond the local neighbourhood became a daunting task without electricity. Railways, though still vital, ran on reduced schedules, with blackout rules forcing many trains to operate only in daylight. Platforms stood in near darkness, and passengers boarded carriages lit by a few lanterns or none at all. Journeys were slow, often interrupted by inspections or sudden stops during air raid warnings. For civilians, a trip that once took hours could now stretch into days. Those who could not afford train fares or who lived far from stations often walked. Entire families were seen on country roads, carrying bundles of belongings, guided only by memory of the landscape and the glow of the moon. Bicycles remained the most valued means of personal transport. Riders repaired them endlessly, patching tyres with scraps of cloth or rubber, oiling chains with whatever substitutes they could find. A bicycle could carry food from markets, wood from forests, or messages between towns. To own one was to hold freedom of movement in a time when fuel and electricity were scarce. Carts pulled by horses, donkeys, or even human effort reappeared on city streets. Goods piled high, sacks of potatoes, barrels of water, or bundles of firewood were moved slowly through unlit alleys. Civilians often shared transport, pooling resources to send one cart with supplies for several families. Travel by night was avoided whenever possible. Roads were dangerous without lamps, and fear of raids or patrols kept most people indoors. Still, when journeys were urgent, groups walked together in silence, lanterns covered to hide their glow. Every sound of boots or cartwheels echoed more sharply in the quiet, reminding travellers how vulnerable they were. Border crossings and checkpoints added tension. With no electric systems to speed the process, inspections were done by hand, in dim light, with papers checked slowly. Civilians stood for hours in lines waiting to be cleared, often cold and anxious. Delays became routine, and patience was the only option. Yet travel also revealed resilience. Families devised careful plans, packing food that would not spoil, carrying blankets for unexpected nights outdoors, and memorizing routes in case landmarks were destroyed. Children were taught to recognize fields, rivers, and church spires as guides. Songs and stories helped them remember the way, transforming fear into something manageable. Travel without electricity was heavy with uncertainty, but it carried purpose. Whether for food, safety, or reunion with loved ones, civilians endured the hardships of slow, dark journeys. Each mile walked or cycled proved that determination could outlast difficulty. In the silence of roads and the dim light of lanterns, people kept moving forward, step by step, refusing to let darkness stop them. Rationing without electricity added another layer of strain to daily survival. Distribution centres could not rely on electric scales or registers, so every transaction was done by hand. Clerks carefully weighed flour, sugar, or grains using mechanical balances, recording amounts in ledgers by candlelight. Long lines formed outside ration offices, with families waiting for hours, often in cold or rain, to collect their allotted portions. Without electric lighting, these places closed early, forcing civilians to plan their days around the chance to secure food. Storage of rations became a careful science. With no refrigeration, households divided portions into small amounts, keeping some in jars, others in cloth sacks, and the rest hidden in cellars. Families learned quickly that wasting even a crumb was unthinkable. Leftovers were transformed into soups or stews, and stale bread was softened in milk or broth. Candles were sometimes used as timers when boiling grains, ensuring nothing was overcooked, as fuel itself was a rationed commodity. Barter thrived under these conditions. If a family had more of one item, they traded with neighbours, sugar for coal, soap for beans, or flour for cloth. Skills became part of this system as well. A seamstress might sew in exchange for extra potatoes, while a cobbler repaired boots for a jar of jam. The absence of electricity gave new weight to such exchanges, as everything depended on trust and fairness rather than official systems alone. Children also participated. They carried ration cards, stood in lines, and learned to count carefully when supplies were handed out. Parents used the process as a way to teach discipline, explaining why every scrap mattered. For many children, the memory of rationing stayed vivid long after the war. Small hands gripping bread, the taste of watery soup, the quiet pride of bringing something home. Scarcity fostered ingenuity. Families stretched ingredients with substitutes, roasted barley for coffee, mashed turnips for flour, or powdered milk for cream. Meals were plain, but survival depended on creativity. Recipes were shared widely. often scribbled on scraps of paper and passed between neighbours, becoming a community's collective cookbook. Rationing without electricity was not simply about food, it was about patience, cooperation, and endurance. Every candle burned in a ration line, every careful scoop measured by hand, symbolised the determination to persist. Though shortages weighed heavily, civilians discovered that solidarity and ingenuity could balance the scales, even when the world around them was dark. Adaptation of daily routines without electricity became one of the most defining features of wartime life. Civilians learned to live by the rhythm of natural light. At dawn, families rose quickly, eager to complete chores while visibility was good. Cooking, washing, and sewing were all tasks pressed into the daylight hours, because once the sun disappeared, only candles or lanterns remained. These short evenings shaped how people organised every part of their day. Work that required precision, like mending clothes, writing letters, or studying, was done early, while heavier tasks such as chopping wood or hauling water filled the middle of the day. Evenings were devoted to simpler routines, eating, sharing stories, or preparing for the next sunrise. Rest too came earlier, with many households going to sleep shortly after dark. Without electric clocks and alarms, bodies adjusted naturally to this pattern, guided more by sunlight than by minutes or hours. Families found comfort in the predictability, even as war disrupted everything else. Weekly routines shifted as well. Laundry day, market day, and communal gatherings were all carefully planned around available light. In cities, ration offices and shops opened as early as possible to maximise daylight, while in rural villages, neighbours often coordinated to share chores. If one family had more firewood or a brighter lantern, they invited others to join in mending or reading. These small acts of cooperation helped everyone adjust more smoothly. Children adapted quickly. Playtime was concentrated outdoors, where they invented games with sticks, stones, or scraps of cloth. At night, they settled into routines of listening to stories or helping with simple chores by the fire. Their resilience often gave parents strength, as laughter filled otherwise heavy evenings. The absence of electricity also brought civilians closer to nature's cycles. Farmers observed moon phases more carefully, knowing that full moons offered precious extra light for outdoor work. In towns, people became attuned to the sounds of their environment: dogs barking, roosters crowing, church bells ringing, each serving as natural signals of time and order. Though it was a struggle, many later remembered how the slower pace deepened bonds within families and communities. The lack of electricity forced a return to traditions older than machines, where patience and cooperation shaped survival. Daily life became less about convenience and more about discipline, intention, and resilience. These adjusted routines were not chosen, but they revealed how adaptable humans could be. Civilians learned that even in darkness, order could be created, and through that order, hope could quietly endure. Reflection on life without electricity during the war reveals not only hardship, but also remarkable resilience. Civilians were forced to let go of conveniences they once considered ordinary: lights at the flip of a switch, radios humming with music, stoves that cooked quickly and evenly. In their place came candles, hand tools, and routines guided by the rising and setting of the sun. At first, these changes felt like loss, but over time, they became proof of human adaptability. Families discovered strength they had not known they possessed. They learned to cook with less, to warm themselves with layered clothing, to preserve food in cellars and jars. Children grew up with stories by firelight instead of cinema screens, and those stories became cherished memories, carrying wisdom across generations. Work slowed, but it never stopped. Hands replaced machines, patience replaced speed. Every small achievement, mended clothes, harvested vegetables, a safely delivered letter, was celebrated as a victory against darkness. Communities, too, found resilience in cooperation. Neighbours shared candles, tools, and news. They gathered in barns, courtyards, and shelters, finding light in each other's presence. Markets became places not only of trade but of solidarity, where bartering and conversation offered comfort. Faith and tradition provided rhythm, helping civilians mark time and hold on to meaning even when modern systems failed. Though the absence of electricity brought danger, silence, and fear, it also uncovered a deeper truth. Survival was possible through simplicity, cooperation, and endurance. When power returned after the war, many civilians carried with them the lessons learned in those dark years. They remembered how to stretch food, how to adapt to natural cycles, and how to value light not as a constant but as a gift. Above all, they remembered the strength of community and family ties forged in hardship. Looking back, life without electricity was more than inconvenience. It was a test of patience and ingenuity, a reminder that even stripped of modern comforts people could endure. In the glow of a single candle, in the steady rhythm of shared labour, civilians discovered that the human spirit shines brightest when everything else grows dark. That quiet resilience, born in the hardest years, became part of their legacy, a lesson for future generations about the power of adaptation and the enduring strength of hope.